Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, China's Xi Jinping accuses the US of blocking his country's rise, and his government sets the lowest GDP target in decades. Is Beijing's rip-roaring growth over, or will it outpace the US? Also this week, the UN called for a revolution of support for the world's poorest nations at a summit in Doha. The president of Malawi tells us how least developed countries can reach their full potential. Plus, cutting-edge gene therapies are potentially life-saving medicines, but the drugs come at an astronomical price. Can the cost be brought down, and who should foot the bill? Xi Jinping heads into his third term as China's president with sweeping changes to financial and tech regulation. The Chinese leader is bracing for a tough competition between the world's two largest economies, and he's made it clear he considers the US an important threat to his country's growth, blaming what he called an American-led campaign of suppression for his nation's troubles. Xi's rare direct criticism of Washington comes after the nation set its lowest GDP target in decades. Outgoing Chinese Premier Li Keqiang announced a GDP target of just 5% for this year at the opening of the National People's Congress. Li said the government aims to create around 12 million urban jobs, keep the unemployment rate at around 5.5%, and boost the defence budget by more than 7%. He's also vowed to support privately owned businesses and encourage foreign investment. China's GDP expanded by just 3% last year, well short of the official target of around 5.5%, but the economy appears to be rebounding strongly after the pandemic. Manufacturing activity in February, for example, expanded at the fastest pace in more than a decade. However, Chinese officials warned of risks ahead. The US has imposed several restrictions on China's access to high-end technology over the past few months, but a new report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute found that Beijing leads the world in 37 out of 44 critical technologies and is in a position to become the world's top technology superpower. Among the fields dominated by China are drones, machine learning, electric batteries, and nuclear energy. The United States leads in just 7 critical technologies, including space launch systems and quantum computing. The UK and India are among the top 5 countries in 29 of the 44 technologies. Well, joining me now from London is Douglas McWilliams. He's the Executive Deputy Chairman of the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Good to have you with us, Douglas. Xi Jinping blames Washington for his country's economic slowdown. How much has America's trade war and the export restrictions really impacted China's economy? Is it to blame?
Well, their exports are down by about 6%, so it is a partial factor. But I think the recent problems in China have a lot more to do with, first of all, the problems of COVID and the way it exploded after they opened up a bit, and then the recovery from that. I don't think that you can entirely blame Washington for China's woes.
What do you make then of China's modest economic growth outlook, its GDP forecast? I mean, by anyone else's standards, it would be pretty good, but by China's, it's pretty low.
You stole my words from me. I was about to say that if you think 5% is modest, just look at what the rest of us are going for. I mean, when you climb higher up the mountain, the air gets thinner, and the possibility of growing at double-digit rates is no longer there. 5% for a huge economy like China is still a pretty decent rate of growth. Incidentally, it's not only the Chinese government forecast, it's also our forecast. We think that's roughly what they're going to be achieving now. And that's a pretty healthy lick for a fairly sophisticated economy now.
You think then that the days of double-digit growth for China are well and truly over now?
They can't. They don't have the labor supplies to achieve that. And they don't have the headroom. I mean, when you start from a very low base, when your economy is very low income, you've obviously got a lot of there's a lot of scope for you to grow. But China is now a sophisticated economy. You can't grow sophisticated economies at 10% plus.
Beijing's move to tighten control over bodies overseeing the finance sector and the scientific and technology sectors too. How do you think that's going to affect the Chinese economy?
It probably won't have much effect on growth in the short term, but these are the sorts of things that insidiously slow down your rate of growth over a period of 10, 20 years. So it probably means that looking out in a quarter of a century's time, their economy will have been smaller because of the extent of the government interference. One of the things that you really need in the modern world is creativity. And if the government is trying to restrict creativity, it will slow down the rate of Chinese growth.
An Australian think tank says that China could be in a position to become the world's top technology superpower in the future. Should the US be worried?
They've said that I think in 10 out of 14 technologies, China is going to be in the lead. And I don't think that's a wrong assessment, but I think they're talking mainly about physical technology. And as I said earlier, creativity is the biggest driving force. And I think the way the Chinese government is running the economy is reducing their ability to get the greatest amount of creativity out of the Chinese population and out of Chinese enterprises. So my guess is that they won't do quite as well as the Australian think tank thinks. While I think the Americans have still got quite a lot going for them, and they will be able to take advantage of their much freer environment.
Douglas, your organisation had predicted some time ago that the Chinese economy could outpace the US by 2030 to 2036. Do you still see that happening?
It's pretty inevitable that China will overtake the US because the population is 4 times bigger than that of the US. And so it means that when GDP per capita reaches only a quarter of the American level, Chinese GDP mathematically will be bigger. But there is no prize for being first in this world. China will still be a relatively less sophisticated economy, and it will simply be an economy with a lot of people in it. So that's the way it's going. It will happen, I'm pretty certain. It's just when it happens is less certain. We now think it will be later rather than earlier. It could even be later than that. It could even be delayed towards 2040. But they're roughly the same size even now. And the gap will narrow as we move on out.
Douglas, China's economic plan doesn't involve any big stimulus packages. President Xi has called on the private sector to help in the fight alongside the government. I mean, can the private sector be an economic driver? And the lack of stimulus packages or announcements on stimulus a mistake, do you think?
Well, they've run out of ammunition a bit, so it is a lot more difficult for them to push state-controlled spending and so on now, with all the packages that they have had and the money that's been used up for bailouts and the property sector and so on. But I think it is realistic to expect what they technically call in China revenge spending, which sounds slightly frightening, but what it actually is the spending that was suppressed during the COVID period when there was a lot of lockdown and so on. People built up huge savings, and they're expecting that the private sector will unleash these savings and turn them into spending. And there's already plenty of sign of that. People are buying many more clothes, they're buying many more electronic goods, and of course travel has suddenly just taken off. Sorry, it's not perhaps the most appropriate metaphor, but you know what I mean. Travel is exploding as an expenditure item. And I think that it is reasonable for the Chinese government to expect that the private sector will actually be the thing that drags the economy forward this time.
Is this modest, as we said, economic target, this GDP target, actually achievable, do you think?
I think so. It does depend on whether they get another bout of COVID, because their vaccination record isn't fantastic. And it also does depend on the rest of the world. Now, most of the news we've had in recent months for the rest of the world has been fairly positive. Everyone's revising up their growth forecasts, and I think that is supportive of the Chinese economy.
Good to talk to you, Douglas. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
The The world's least developed countries, or LDCs, are defined as having an average national income of around $1,000 per person. More than 1 billion people live in those 46 nations, and many of them survive on less than $2 a day. Barely half the population has access to electricity, and only 1 in 5 can plug into the internet. Rising food prices, high debt, climate change, and diseases such as COVID-19 are wearing them down even more. Well, world leaders gathered at the UN's Least Developed Countries Once in a Decade Summit in Qatar's capital to revive commitments to the Doha Programme of Action. The plan focuses on 6 areas, including how to eradicate poverty, enhance trade, deal with food insecurity, and how best to tackle climate change. The UN has called on wealthy nations to provide $500 billion a year to help those nations boost their economies. Qatar has announced a $60 million financial contribution. Al Jazeera's Natasha Ghanaim spoke to the president of Malawi and the chair of the LDC group, Lazarus Chakwera, at the summit here in Doha. She asked him first how least developed countries can help to solve their own problems.
Malawi has 2063 to become an inclusively wealthy, self-reliant, industrialized nation, upper middle income. It means for us, the first 10 years that we started out last year, implementing our movement toward that realization, every country needs to have that and then align their own vision with the Doha Program of Action, which is a consensus built over the years by countries, not just the least developed, involving the others, the development partners, so that we are working in a concerted effort, bringing synergies together that spur exponential development. For example, Malawi's case, we are wanting to concentrate in the immediate future on agricultural commercialization and mechanization so that we can grow large volumes of crops, diversified across the section, add value to the same, have many industries across the country, and export. So we earn more money to be able to access goods and services that we may not have presently. And so if agriculture is emphasized in the manner we are thinking, even do mega farms to a great extent, and then tourism, and then mining. We had a geomapping of the country. We thought maybe we didn't have anything, and yet there are minerals, gemstones that are, being discovered, even rutile and graphite. So we think if we can immediately have investors come work with us, the story of Malawi will be different. So will be the stories of many of these least developed countries.
What would meaningful progress look like when it comes to assisting least developed countries?
I see development in terms of the Doha Program of Action leading many nations to graduate. There are certain developmental matters within the Program of Action which must, of necessity, be accomplished. Online universities and stuff like this, ensuring the youth and the women are included in all of these processes. It means everyone's hands are on deck. Everybody is working toward the fulfillment of this.
There is an outstanding issue of public debt and loan conditions by the IMF and high interest rates. How can these things be reformed to help address the specific challenges of least developed countries?
The reforms that we demand, even the debt relief that we demand, is not necessarily because we just want freebies or something for free. It is because there's a realization much of the developed world has so developed by actually exploiting the natural resources in a way that has brought more problems than solutions. And so you cannot ask, for example, smaller nations who have contributed very little, for example, to this whole issue of carbon emissions, ask them to do something different from the way they developed and expect that they will do that without any assistance, because there are all manner of things that are happening which call for, climate justice, really, and a rethinking of the whole process of lending institutions, where sometimes they're not necessarily giving you a hand up. They are actually perpetuating a dependency syndrome that needs to be broken. And so we need to rethink these things and ask the tough questions as to, is this really producing what was intended? How long have these institutions been there? And how is it that others are still struggling the manner in which they are?
The UN Secretary General slammed rich countries and energy giants for burdening LDCs with what he called predatory interest rates. 25 developing economies spend more than 20% of their revenues on servicing debt. The International Monetary Fund has been criticised for imposing tough conditions on countries seeking loans. The IMF told Counting the Cost that it's pushing for more action on providing debt relief.
The Secretary General, I know, has been calling for greater action. The Managing Director of the IMF has also been calling for stronger action to speed up the delivery of debt relief to those countries who have unsustainable debts and who need debt restructuring. We've put forward a number of proposals to try and make the process smoother and faster so that countries can restructure their debt sooner rather than later.
Now, gene therapy works by adding a new gene or repairing a mutated one inside the body to treat or cure rare and dangerous diseases. The one-time treatment can potentially save the lives of millions of people, but they're the world's most expensive drugs. Health systems and insurers struggle to cover the costs, making access to the therapies very limited. So, how can they become more accessible? That question was top of the agenda at last week's Genome Editing Conference in London, from where Jonah Hull reports.
One of the key issues being discussed at this Human Genome Editing Summit among scientists, ethicists and policymakers is the prohibitive cost of genome editing treatments for rare diseases caused by single-cell mutations. Think sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's, congenital blindness, even cancers and HIV. The problem exists because of a combination of onerous government regulations in the development of any new treatment, often by companies that are profit-based in the private sector, so that the process becomes cumbersome, the costs jaw-droppingly high. In fact, one treatment for a rare blood disease, known as the most expensive on the planet, currently costs $3.5 million for just a single dose. So that it becomes a question not just of easing those government regulations, but also of securing government funding for research. And that means persuading taxpayers that they should be paying for research into rare diseases, even though huge gaps remain in treating common ailments. So while the technology exists that could help the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world, taking it mainstream could become one of the next great horizons of human genome editing.
Well, joining me now here in Doha is Colin Baker, Al Jazeera's science editor. Colin, why are gene therapies so expensive?
Scientists have new tools and techniques that can correct the human genome inside the human body. That's a very big deal. And we're talking about serious diseases that affect small populations with great severity. So that's a tantalizing problem to solve. The problem is it really raises three difficult issues for the market. One, you have a small patient population. Two, you have drugs that are very expensive to develop and traditionally have taken a long time to develop. That might soon change. And 3, these are one-time use drugs. When you combine those 3 factors, you get a real question about how to price them. And the pricing that we've seen has been astronomical. We see a new record-breaking drug almost every year now. Drugs for blood disorders, for neurological diseases have soared above $2 and $3 million for a dose.
Obviously, Big Pharma needs a return on its investment, but are the prices fair?
Fairness is a really tough question to answer in this particular environment, because you do have a lot of scientific questions that still need to be answered and avenues of attack that still need to be resolved before we get to sort of a mainstreaming of these types of drugs. How to deliver them to the places in the body where they're needed. You know, some diseases are easier to attack perhaps in the bone marrow or in the back of the eye, a certain genetic blindness that's inherited. These are places where we sort of know how to deliver drugs. Others, for say, muscle or perhaps diseases that affect the brain and the central nervous system, might be a little harder to deliver. So some of the techniques and technologies that are required to get there still require investment. But when it comes to fairness, the regulators are asking the same question, and you have some drugs makers in Europe, as well as in America, who've pulled their products mid-development because the regulators simply said, look, you can't charge more than a certain amount for this drug, and the drugs maker said, that's not sustainable for us, and they pulled mid-development, leaving those few hundreds of patients with very serious conditions in the lurch.
Which seems desperately unfair. Ultimately, who should foot the bill? I mean, are public and private insurers ready to step up and pay these astronomical costs?
It's difficult. In Canada, you had a family that raised over $3 million to try to fund a therapy for their own child. They raised that through sort of means like GoFundMe. In Europe, where you have single-payer healthcare systems, you are going to have panels deciding how to allocate these resources. In the U.S., where you have private insurers and you have families footing the bill, you have startup companies that are going to try to figure out financing methods. You have guarantees within the treatment plan that if the drug fails, some of that money might not be owed. But I mean, in the end, for instance, the sickle cell therapy that's presumably going to be approved by the US FDA this summer, this is a partnership between the drugs company that wants to make this drug and deliver it to, say, 30,000 people in the coming years, but at the moment, is working with academia. And so you have the sickle cell patient coming in through a trial program funded by the university.
And there are something like 6 million people with sickle cell, most of whom are in sub-Saharan Africa, where many people, as we were hearing earlier, are poor. There's no way that they can afford this kind of therapy. Is it going to be available to them?
This is a really interesting problem because in Africa you do have these robust genetic sequencing, databasing, research efforts led by groups like H3 Africa, and many of their representatives were at this conference, talking about how a pipeline could be developed to move some of these therapies from the places where they currently are. And it's just inevitable that they will be in places that are highly resourced at the moment, because you do need large support teams to deliver these therapies. You need complex systems. Some of the resources that might not be available in facilities in the developing world. How to move these therapies to the developing world. And some of the research that is being done on the African continent is going to aid that effort. One of the big hurdles that, for instance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is trying to overcome is how to move some of these therapies from procedures that are done out of the human body, where you remove cells, edit them, place them back in with a fair amount of infrastructure around that process, to something that can be delivered in the human body, what's called in vivo. When we cross that barrier, for instance, for curing sickle cell or for addressing some of the complications of HIV, you could really start to see some of these therapies, although the costs would remain high, being available to be delivered to the places where they're needed most. We're not there yet.
The big question, will costs eventually come down, and when?
Well, will an inflection point come is a really important sort of goal to try to reach. And there are many research organizations and private companies that are trying to get there. New therapies and new technologies like CRISPR, which has only been around for about 10 years. CRISPR-Cas9 is a combination of a protein and a bit of genetic code. It was found in nature. It's both amazingly accurate at being able to reach targeted genetic mutations and also correct them, either by deleting them, interfering with them, or even replacing them with a gene that functions. This is a model that some scientists liken, it's not the same, but liken to the mRNA approach we had after COVID, where you have one platform that could be tuned to attack a spectrum of different types of disorders. That's extremely interesting. And then as you get some of these technologies approved for the delivery of these drugs, you sort of have an iterative process where you have generations of drugs that follow. So it is believed that we will see sort of a roadmap to cheaper options and more widespread options, but we're just at the beginning of this process now.
Colin, many thanks indeed. Our science editor, Colin Baker. And that's our show for this week. Don't forget, if you'd like to comment on anything you've seen, you can get in touch by tweeting me. I'm at A Finnegan. Please remember to use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you can drop us a line. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.